When one approaches the Ten Commandments from the standpoint of spiritual science, one must first free oneself from the modern habit of regarding them merely as moral prescriptions imposed from without. They are not laws in the later juridical sense, nor are they arbitrary demands of a commanding deity. They are revelations of a particular moment in the evolution of human consciousness, and they can only be understood when placed within the great rhythm of post-Atlantean cultural epochs. Steiner emphasizes that each epoch received its spiritual impulses in a form corresponding to the stage of the human soul at that time, and the Decalogue stands precisely at the threshold where humanity was to awaken to a new experience of the I. In the most ancient Indian epoch, the great teachers, the rishis, received their inspirations from the highest regions of the spiritual world, from the upper Devachan. Their wisdom flowed directly into the human soul as revelation. It was not yet experienced as something standing over against the human being. In the Persian epoch, the initiated teachers still rose into the spiritual worlds, though not so high. They reached the lower Devachan. In the Egyptian epoch, initiation reached chiefly into the astral world. Step by step, the immediate openness of humanity to the spiritual worlds diminished. The veil between the human soul and the divine spiritual realms grew denser. This withdrawal was not a loss, but a preparation, for it created the conditions under which the human being could begin to experience himself as an independent bearer of consciousness. It is within this narrowing of the spiritual horizon that the mission of Moses must be understood. The people of Israel were chosen not because of any privilege, but because their soul constitution made them receptive to a revelation that could no longer come as direct spiritual vision. What was required now was a form of revelation that would speak to a humanity standing firmly on the physical plane, a humanity that was beginning to experience itself inwardly as an I. Thus, the central impulse of the Mosaic revelation is not external law-giving, but the awakening of the consciousness of the I in relation to the divine ground of the world. The words, "I am the I am," are not merely theological. They express a decisive turning point in human self-experience. Steiner makes it clear that the Ten Commandments are therefore I commandments. They are addressed to the emerging ego consciousness of humanity. They do not work by overwhelming the human being through visions or by binding him through ancestral instinct. They speak to his inner sense of responsibility. The divine is no longer experienced only in cosmic forces or tribal spirits, but as something that must be born inwardly by the human soul itself. In this sense, the Decalogue represents a profound step toward human freedom, even though it appears outwardly as a set of prohibitions. To understand this apparent contradiction, one must grasp that freedom cannot arise in a soul that is still guided entirely from without, whether by instinct, tradition, or clairvoyant perception. True freedom presupposes that the human being can distinguish himself from the divine command, that he can experience the possibility of transgression, and thus the responsibility for moral action. The Ten Commandments do not compel through inner necessity. They confront the human being with boundaries that must be consciously respected. In doing so, they awaken the moral I. Steiner draws attention to the fact that the commandments are not primarily formulated as positive instructions to perform certain deeds, but as indications of limits. Thou shalt not. This negative form is not a deficiency. It is an educational necessity. At this stage of evolution, humanity could not yet act out of fully autonomous moral intuition. What could be given were signposts showing where the human being would fall away from the divine order if he surrendered to lower impulses. In this way, the commandments protect the nascent I from dissolving again into instinctual or collective forces. At the same time, Steiner explains that these commandments were not abstract moral rules, but were intimately connected with the concrete conditions of life on the physical plane. They were meant to guide the external development of humanity in such a way that it could remain in harmony with the divine intentions working through evolution. The moral order and the cosmic order were not yet separated. To violate the commandments was not merely a private moral failing. It meant disturbing the relationship between humanity and the spiritual powers guiding earthly evolution. What is decisive for the theme of human freedom is that the commandments no longer work through immediate spiritual compulsion. In earlier epochs, to act against divine guidance would have been almost unthinkable because the divine was experienced as a living presence within perception itself. Now, the human being could disobey. This possibility of disobedience is the shadow side of freedom, but without it, freedom could never arise. The Ten Commandments therefore stand at the beginning of a path that leads not away from the divine, but toward a new, inwardly one relationship to it. In the next part, I will unfold how Steiner interprets the individual commandments in relation to the evolving I, and how this prepares the later transformation of law into inner moral freedom. When Steiner turns to the inner structure of the Ten Commandments, he makes it clear that they are not an arbitrary collection of moral rules, but a coherent whole that addresses the human being in his totality. They speak to thinking, feeling, and willing, and they do so in a sequence that reflects the gradual consolidation of the human I within earthly existence. Each commandment can be understood as a protective boundary erected around a specific sphere of human life, so that the emerging ego may learn to orient itself without losing its connection to the divine source from which it springs. The first commandments are directed above all to the relation between the human I and the divine I. "Thou shalt have no other gods beside me" is not a demand for exclusive worship in a narrow confessional sense. Steiner emphasizes that it expresses the necessity for the human being to gather his soul forces around a unified spiritual center. In earlier epochs, human consciousness was scattered among many divine powers, many spiritual agencies that worked directly into perception and instinct. Now the human being must learn to concentrate his soul life, to relate himself to a single, unifying divine principle. Only such concentration can give rise to a stable ego consciousness. Without it, the I would fragment and lose itself in the multiplicity of impulses streaming in from the outer and inner worlds. Closely connected with this is the commandment against making images. Steiner explains that this prohibition is not hostility toward art or imagination, but a profound educational measure. The divine is no longer to be grasped through sensory or imaginative representations. The human being is to learn to experience the divine inwardly, through the awakening of the I itself. Images bind the soul to outer forms. The future development of humanity requires an inner non-sensory relationship to the spiritual world. In this sense, the commandment prepares the ground for a freedom that is rooted in inner experience rather than in external authority. As Steiner proceeds, he shows how the commandments gradually descend from the purely spiritual sphere into the social and moral life of the community. The commandment concerning the sanctification of the Sabbath, for example, is not merely a regulation of time. It expresses the necessity of creating rhythmic interruptions in earthly activity, moments in which the human being can recollect himself and reconnect with his spiritual origin. Freedom cannot arise in a soul that is completely absorbed in external labor and necessity. The rhythmic return to the spiritual dimension is therefore an essential condition for the healthy development of the I. When the commandments turn toward human relationships, toward parents, toward life, toward property and truthfulness, they reveal even more clearly their role in the education of freedom. Steiner points out that honoring father and mother is not blind submission to authority, but recognition of the karmic and spiritual forces that have brought the human being into existence. By learning gratitude and reverence for one's origin, the I gains inner firmness. It learns to stand within a meaningful order rather than against it. Such inner firmness is a prerequisite for freedom, for only a self that is inwardly grounded can act freely. The prohibition of murder, adultery, theft, and false witness are likewise not merely social regulations. They protect the integrity of the human being as a moral individual. To destroy life, to misuse sexuality, to appropriate what belongs to another, or to distort truth are all ways in which the I undermines its own foundation. Steiner emphasizes that these acts damage not only external order, but the inner structure of the soul itself. A soul that habituates itself to such actions becomes inwardly dependent on impulses that do not arise from the true core of the I. In this sense, the commandments are guardians of inner freedom, long before freedom can be consciously realized. Particularly important is Steiner's indication that these commandments work differently from later moral teachings. They do not yet appeal to love or moral intuition. They appeal to conscience as a boundary experience. The human being feels, if I cross this boundary, I separate myself from the divine order of the world. This feeling is still bound to fear and reverence, but it already contains the germ of responsibility. Responsibility is the seed from which freedom will later grow. Steiner also makes clear that the Decalogue was given to a whole people, not to isolated individuals. At this stage of evolution, the I was still strongly embedded in the collective life of the tribe. Freedom could not yet be an individual achievement. It had to be prepared within a communal framework. The commandments thus shape a social organism within which the individual I can gradually awaken. They create a moral atmosphere that supports the fragile beginnings of ego consciousness. In the next part, I will show how Steiner understands the inner transformation of these commandments in later epochs, and how the path leads from external law toward inwardly experienced moral freedom. When Steiner looks beyond the Mosaic epoch, he does not treat the Ten Commandments as something that has simply been superseded or abolished. Rather, he shows that their true significance only becomes fully visible when one understands how they are inwardly transformed in the later development of humanity. What was once given as external law must gradually be taken up into the depths of the human soul. The commandments themselves do not change in their essence, but the way in which the human being relates to them undergoes a profound metamorphosis. This metamorphosis is the real history of human freedom. In the Mosaic time, the human being still experienced the divine command as something standing over against him. Even though the I was awakening, it was not yet strong enough to generate moral impulses out of itself. The law therefore had to confront the human being from outside as something objective and authoritative. Steiner stresses that this was not a deficiency, but a necessity. Had the law been inwardly individualized too early, the I would have been overwhelmed by instincts and egotistical impulses. The external character of the commandments was a protective shell, within which the I could slowly gain strength. As evolution proceeds, however, this shell must be broken open. Steiner points to the decisive turning point in this process, the Christ impulse. What the Ten Commandments prepared in germinal form is fulfilled when the law is no longer merely heard, but becomes inwardly experienced as love. This does not mean that the commandments lose their validity. Rather, they are lifted into a higher sphere. The "thou shalt not" is transformed into an inner capacity to will the good. The boundary becomes an impulse arising from within the soul itself. Steiner's perspective makes it clear that freedom does not consist in the rejection of moral law, but in its inner assimilation. A human being is not free because he ignores the commandments, but because he no longer experiences them as something alien. He acts in accordance with them because his own being has become attuned to the same spiritual order from which they originally sprang. Freedom, in this sense, is not arbitrariness, but harmony between the individual I and the divine world order. This transformation, however, is not automatic. Steiner emphasizes that humanity as a whole moves through stages, and individuals participate in these stages to very different degrees. Even in later epochs, many human beings still need the support of external moral norms. This does not contradict freedom. It shows that freedom is an achievement, not a given. The Ten Commandments continue to work wherever the I has not yet become strong enough to guide itself securely from within. What is particularly characteristic of Steiner's view is that he does not see freedom as a merely intellectual or philosophical concept. Freedom is a real spiritual force that must be developed through inner work. The commandments, understood in their deeper sense, point toward this work. They educate the soul to recognize where it becomes unfree, where it is driven by desire, fear, or untruth, and thus they indirectly point toward the path of liberation. Even their prohibitive form serves this aim, for it draws attention to those regions of the soul where unconscious compulsion still reigns. Steiner also indicates that the Decalogue has a cosmic dimension. The moral order expressed in the commandments is not an arbitrary human invention. It reflects the lawful structure of the spiritual worlds. To live against this order is not merely a social or psychological problem, but a disharmony with the forces that sustain evolution itself. In this sense, freedom is not independence from the cosmos, but conscious participation in its purposes. The human being becomes free by knowing what he does and by willing in alignment with the spiritual realities of existence. Thus, the path from the Ten Commandments to human freedom is not a straight line that leaves the commandments behind. It is a spiral movement. Humanity first receives the law from outside, then gradually carries it inward, and finally transforms it into an individual capacity for moral insight and action. The commandments remain present at every stage, but their mode of presence changes. What was once command becomes conscience. What was once obedience becomes responsibility. In the final part, I will bring this movement to its culmination by showing how, in Steiner's understanding, the fully developed I can stand freely within the moral world order while remaining faithful to the impulse that first spoke through the Ten Commandments. At the culmination of Steiner's presentation, the Ten Commandments appear no longer as something belonging merely to a distant religious past, but as a living foundation that continues to work into the future of humanity. What changes is not their truth content, but the locus in which this truth lives. In the beginning, it lived in the divine spiritual world and was impressed upon humanity from without. In the future, it must live within the human being himself. This inward migration of the moral law is the deepest expression of human freedom. Steiner makes it clear that the fully developed I does not stand outside the moral world order, nor does it invent morality according to subjective preference. Rather, the free human being becomes capable of recognizing, through inner spiritual activity, the same moral realities that once had to be given as commandments. Freedom, in this sense, is cognition transformed into will. The human being does not act morally because he must, nor because he fears punishment or hopes for reward, but because he sees what is right and unites his willing with this insight. Seen from this perspective, the Ten Commandments can be understood as an anticipation of a future stage of humanity. They describe, in a negative and protective form, the contours of a moral world in which the human being will one day move freely and creatively. What was once safeguarded through prohibition will later be safeguarded through conscious love for the good. Yet even then, the substance of the commandments remains present, for the spiritual realities to which they point do not change. Steiner emphasizes that this future freedom must not be confused with lawlessness. A will that is merely arbitrary is not free. It is enslaved by impulses it does not understand. True freedom arises only where the human being has so strengthened his I that it can bear moral insight without external support. In such a human being, the commandments live on as inner organs of perception for the moral world. He no longer needs to be told, "Thou shalt not kill," because he experiences directly the sacredness of human life. He no longer needs to be told, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," because truthfulness has become a necessity of his own being. In this sense, Steiner shows that the Ten Commandments were never meant to be the final word on morality. They were a beginning, a necessary starting point in a long education of humanity. Their greatness lies precisely in the fact that they do not abolish freedom, but prepare it. They mark the moment when the human being was first addressed as a responsible I, capable of standing in relation to the divine, not merely as a recipient of revelation, but as a bearer of moral consciousness. At the same time, Steiner does not idealize the present. He makes it clear that modern humanity stands in a tension between these stages. The old authority of external law has weakened, but the inner capacity for moral intuition is not yet universally developed. This creates the danger of misunderstanding freedom as mere self-assertion. In such a situation, a deeper understanding of the Ten Commandments becomes especially important. They can serve as reminders of the spiritual seriousness of moral life, even where their external authority is no longer accepted. Thus, the Ten Commandments and human freedom are not opposites, but successive expressions of the same spiritual impulse. What once spoke from the thunder of Sinai must gradually be heard as a quiet but firm voice within the human soul. The task of humanity is to transform this voice from command into insight, from law into love. Only then will the human being truly stand as a free being within the moral cosmos, fulfilling in conscious freedom what was once given to him as divine command. When one follows Steiner's line of thought to its furthest consequences, it becomes evident that the relationship between the Ten Commandments and human freedom is not merely a historical or theological question, but a task that continues to live within every individual soul. What once unfolded on the stage of world history must now be reenacted inwardly. Each human being, in the course of his own development, recapitulates in miniature what humanity as a whole has undergone across epochs. The transition from guidance through external authority to guidance through inner insight. Steiner makes it clear that this inner reenactment is neither automatic nor easy. The I must first experience its own limitations. As long as moral impulses are taken over unconsciously from tradition, education, or social pressure, the human being may behave correctly, but he is not yet free. At the same time, when these outer supports fall away prematurely, the I can experience itself as abandoned, exposed to impulses that arise from lower layers of the soul. In this vulnerable space, the deeper meaning of the Ten Commandments can reappear, not as imposed law, but as a mirror in which the soul learns to recognize itself. In this sense, the commandments can be understood as instruments of self-knowledge. Each "thou shalt not" points to a region of the human being where freedom is not yet fully realized, where instinct, desire, or unconscious habit still seeks to dominate. To encounter these boundaries consciously is not a regression to an earlier stage of obedience, but an opportunity for inner strengthening. The human being learns where he must still work on himself in order to act out of his true I, rather than out of compulsion. Steiner's approach, therefore, avoids both moral authoritarianism and moral relativism. He does not ask the human being to submit blindly to commandments, nor does he encourage him to discard them as obsolete. Instead, he invites a transformation of consciousness. What once came as command is to become inner content. The human being is to learn to hear, within his own thinking and feeling, the same spiritual order that once spoke through revelation. This is why Steiner can speak of the Ten Commandments as having been necessary at a particular moment, while at the same time pointing beyond them toward a future morality grounded in freedom. This future, however, is not a utopia detached from reality. It is prepared through concrete inner work, through the purification of thinking, the schooling of feeling, and the ethical discipline of the will. Only a soul that has learned to think truthfully, to feel responsibly, and to will consciously can bear freedom without falling into arbitrariness. In such a soul, the commandments no longer appear as restrictions, but as descriptions of a moral reality that is directly experienced. Steiner thus shows that freedom is not the negation of divine order, but its most mature expression. In earlier times, divine order had to be protected from humanity. Later, it must be entrusted to humanity. The Ten Commandments stand at the threshold of this trust. They mark the moment when the human being was first addressed as a being capable of responsibility, even though he was not yet capable of full freedom. Their enduring significance lies in the fact that they continue to remind the human soul of its origin and its goal. Seen in this light, the true question is not whether the Ten Commandments are still valid, but how they live within us. Do they confront us as external demands, provoking resistance or submission? Or do they awaken within us a deeper listening, a recognition of the moral structure of the world and of our place within it? According to Steiner, the answer to this question determines the quality of our freedom. Thus, the path from the Ten Commandments to human freedom is ultimately a path of inner transformation. It leads from hearing to understanding, from obedience to responsibility, from law to love. What once resounded from Sinai as a voice from beyond the human being is destined to become a quiet certainty within him. In realizing this transformation, the human being does not abandon the spiritual heritage of the past. He fulfills it by carrying it forward into conscious, freely chosen moral action.